This week, I invite you to walk with me through the summary of Lesson 3 of the Sabbath School Study titled Pride versus Humility. There was a Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men who ever lived. He commanded armies, ruled millions, and shaped the laws of an entire empire. And yet, every single morning before he did anything else, he would sit quietly and remind himself in writing that he was just a man, fallible, small, capable of being wrong. His private journal, which we now call Meditations, was never meant to be published, never meant for anyone else's eyes. It was just a guy, one of the most powerful guys in human history, talking himself down from his own ego every single day because he understood something most powerful people never do. Pride, left unchecked, destroys everything it touches, quietly and slowly, from the inside out. The interesting part about this for me is that he was a pagan philosopher. He never read the Bible. He never heard of Jesus. But he figured out something very Christian, that many people who do know Jesus still struggle to actually live. Which tells you how deep this thing runs in all of us, whether you know Christ personally or not. The memory text this week comes from Luke chapter 14, verse 11, where Jesus himself says, "For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." And the more you sit with that, the more you realize it is basically the entire world turned upside down, because everything around us says, push yourself forward. Be loud, be seen. Make sure people know your name. And Jesus quietly says, yeah, that's actually not how this works. And this whole week is about unpacking why and what it looks like for ordinary people living ordinary lives right now. Before we dive in, here is a fascinating little thing to carry with you. Psychologists have studied what they call the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is essentially this: the less competent someone is in a given area, the more confident and superior they tend to feel about it. And the more genuinely skilled someone becomes, the more they realize how little they actually know. In other words, wisdom and humility tend to travel together, and arrogance tends to travel with ignorance. I'd say the Bible figured that out long before psychology did. Now, the lesson opens on Sunday with something it calls the tight fingers of pride. And I love that image, because pride doesn't loosen its grip easily, does it? You know what I mean? Think about how sneaky it is. The lesson traces it all the way back before time, before Eden, before humanity ever had the chance to mess anything up. Pride started with Lucifer, the highest created being in existence, someone who literally stood in the presence of God every single day. And somehow, impossibly, quietly, thoughts of selfishness began creeping in. We don't know exactly how or when. But what we do know is that those thoughts set off a chain reaction that is still echoing through every human life today, including yours and mine. 1 John chapter 2 verses 15 through 17 talks about what the lesson calls loving the world. And not the world as in sunsets and mountain trails and great food, but the system, the desire to be admired, to have more, to feel like you matter more than the person next to you. And the passage makes this sobering point. All of that, the pride of life, the hunger for status and significance, it is not from God, and it passes away. It has an expiry date stamped right on it. But the person who does the will of God, that lasts. It gets a little uncomfortable though, to be honest, because the lesson makes this really sharp observation. When we think of proud people, our minds immediately go somewhere else. The difficult boss, the insufferable relative at family gatherings, the person at work who always finds a way to make sure everyone knows they were the one with the idea. But the real question, the one the lesson is actually asking, is what about you? What about me? Because pride is not always the loud, dramatic kind. Sometimes it is the quiet refusal to admit you are wrong. Sometimes it is the thin-skinned way you react when you don't get the credit you think you deserve. Sometimes it is just the subtle way you feel just a little bit superior to someone going through a struggle you think you would have handled better. And the question Sunday leaves with us is this: how prideful am I really? Not compared to someone else. Actually, genuinely, me. How is my own pride quietly building a wall between me and God? How is it affecting the people closest to me? Because here is the anchor point. Our value doesn't come from what we own or what we've achieved or how impressive our life looks from the outside. It comes from the fact that we were made by God, and we are the very people Jesus came and died for. That is where the value lives. And when we actually believe that, pride loses a lot of its power over us. That is Sunday. Then Monday takes us somewhere even more specific. The portion of the lesson for Monday is one that stopped me when I read it. It's called Know Yourself, and it opens with one of the most vivid stories Jesus ever told. Two men walk into a place of worship to pray. One is respected, religiously established, the kind of guy other people point to as an example. He walks to the front where people can see him, and he prays out loud, essentially listing his own spiritual achievements before God. And you kind of want to cringe reading it. The other man is standing at the very back of the room, head down, eyes wet, the weight of his own failures pressing down on him, and he barely gets the words out. Just a whisper, "Please, God, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner." That is his entire prayer, nothing else. And in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14, Jesus tells this story and then drops the line that flips everything on its head. He says the second man, the one in the back corner, the one who brought nothing to the table except his own honesty and brokenness, that man went home right with God, and the first man did not. Which is just stunning, because by every external measure, the first man was doing better. He was more put together, more impressive, more religious. But Jesus is always looking at something else entirely. And don't miss this part. The lesson draws on Christ's object lessons, page 158, which says, "It is only he who knows himself to be a sinner that Christ can save," which sounds at first like bad news, but it is actually the best news, because it means the way in is not by being impressive. The way in is by being honest. And here's the fascinating thing about actually getting close to Jesus. You would think the closer you get, the better you'd feel about yourself, right? More confident, more sorted, more together. But the opposite tends to happen. The closer you get to a very bright light, the more clearly you see the dust. And Christ's Object Lessons, page 159, says it plainly. It is ignorance of Jesus that makes people so uplifted in their own righteousness. When you really see him, you stop being quite so impressed with yourself. But here is the beautiful part. 1 John chapter 1 verse 9 is right there waiting. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. You bring it honestly. He handles the rest. That is the deal. So, when did you last genuinely experience God's grace? Not as a concept, as an actual daily reality in your actual life. Because if it's been a while, that might be worth sitting with. Tuesday moves from a story to a real human life. And the lesson for Tuesday is introduced with these words: Moses, humble servant. And can we just take a moment with Moses? Because honestly, his resume before he ever led a single Israelite anywhere was extraordinary. Acts chapter 7 verse 22 tells us he was learned in all the wisdom of Egypt. And Egypt at that time was the most sophisticated civilization on the planet. They built the pyramids. We still aren't entirely sure how. They were advanced in mathematics, medicine, architecture, and governance. And Moses was at the very top of all of it. A general, a philosopher, a legislator, and the throne of the most powerful empire on earth was essentially within reach. Patriarchs and Prophets, page 246, says that as historian, poet, philosopher, general, and legislator, he stood without a peer. And yet, with all of that in front of him, he chose something else. Hebrews chapter 11 verses 24 through 26 tells us why. He considered the suffering of identifying with God's people to be of greater worth than all the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking further ahead than most people bother to look. And then, after an impulsive act of violence cost him everything, he ended up in the desert for 40 years. And I think we sometimes treat those 40 years like a pause, like a gap in the story. But that was where the actual shaping happened. Mountains as classroom walls, sheep as a leadership classroom, silence and obscurity as the curriculum. And what came out the other side? Numbers chapter 12 verse 3 says Moses was more humble than any other person on the face of the earth. The man who split the sea, the man who spoke with God face to face, the most humble person alive. And it makes you wonder, what would his story have looked like if pride had been running things at every turn? At the burning bush, at the palace of Pharaoh, at the edge of the Red Sea, at the foot of Sinai. Pride would have made every single one of those moments about Moses. Humility made every one of them about God. And that is the question for you and me today. If someone who knows you well sat down to describe you honestly, would humble make the list? I wonder. Wednesday brings us to something that feels almost embarrassing to admit. The part of the lesson for Wednesday carries this striking title, The Greatest Offense, and it opens with a scene that is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Imagine you are one of Jesus' disciples. You have walked with him for 3 years, watched him raise the dead, heard him say things that no one had ever said before, been personally chosen by him out of everyone he could have picked. And then, apparently, you and your friends sit around debating which one of you is the greatest. I mean, you really have to sit with how strange that is. Luke chapter 22 verses 24 through 27 captures this moment. And Jesus' response is not to hand out a ranking. He doesn't lecture them. He just quietly says, I am among you as the one who serves, the Son of God, the Creator of everything, describing himself as the servant in the room. And the lesson draws on Christ's object lessons, page 154 here. Now I want you to hear this carefully. There is nothing so offensive to God or so dangerous to the human soul as pride and self-sufficiency. Of all sins, it is the most hopeless, the most incurable, because when pride is in the driver's seat, you are almost always the last to know it. It has this strange quality of creating a blind spot directly over itself. You can spot everyone else's clearly. Your own stays hidden. And the reason this matters so much is that pride may be the single biggest thing standing between many of us and a genuinely close relationship with God. Because closeness with God requires need. It requires knowing you need Him. And pride, by definition, says, you've got this. You're fine. Which is a comfortable place to live, right up until it isn't. The question Wednesday presses into us is honest and a little searching. What might need to change in your life for you to actually humble yourself before God? Thursday turns the camera completely around. And the lesson for Thursday does something simple and almost startling after all the self-examination of the week. It says, with just 2 words as its title, look at Him. Because after all the uncomfortable questions, after sitting with your own pride and the ways it quietly runs things, Thursday says stop looking at yourself for a moment. Just look at Jesus. And the contrast is almost too much to take in. These disciples still occasionally jostling for position, still wondering who's the greatest. And then there's Jesus, washing their feet, eating with people polite society wrote off, touching people no one else would touch, saying quietly and simply, I am among you as the one who serves. Philippians chapter 2 verses 3 through 8 is one of the most breathtaking passages in the entire New Testament. It says Jesus, who existed in the very nature of God, did not hold on to that. He emptied himself, took on human form, humbled himself, and became obedient all the way to death. Death on a cross, which in the Roman world was not just execution. It was designed to be shameful, public, degrading, and Jesus chose it willingly. That is not the posture of someone who needed to be seen or admired. That is the posture of someone so completely free from pride that he could die like a criminal for people who largely did not understand what he was doing for them. And as the desire of ages, pages 436 and 437 says, "The people heaven calls truly holy are the last ones to parade their own goodness." The most childlike disciple is the most effective in God's service. And God places His mark on people not by their rank, their wealth, or their intellectual greatness, but by their oneness with Christ. Which means the path forward is not trying harder to be humble. It is simply getting closer to Him. Because humility is not something you manufacture. You catch it. You receive it as a byproduct of actually seeing Jesus clearly. When you look at Him, really look at Him, your own perceived greatness quietly dissolves. Not because you've been shamed into feeling small, but because something that bright just naturally makes everything else look dim by comparison. And that is the question Thursday leaves hanging in the air. What would it actually look like for you to look at Jesus today? Not as a habit to check off, but to genuinely sit with who He is, what He chose to do, and what He thinks of you specifically. Pride is not just a personality flaw or a social inconvenience. It is a spiritual barrier. It sits between us and God. It sits between us and each other. And it is remarkably hard to see in ourselves, which is exactly why the lesson keeps pointing us in the same direction all week long. Toward Jesus. Because humility is not something you decide your way into. You cannot willpower yourself humble. You catch it from proximity to Him. The disciples argued about greatness, and then watched Jesus kneel with a towel and a basin, and something shifted in them forever. Moses spent 40 years in obscurity and came out the humblest man alive. The broken man in the back of the synagogue whispered a desperate prayer and went home forgiven and clean. The common thread in every single one of those stories. They stopped looking at themselves long enough to see something infinitely bigger. And that something was always Jesus, the one who gave up everything. So let me just bring the whole week together for a moment. Sunday reminded us that pride is a thief, quietly replacing God with self without us even noticing. Monday showed us that the moment we stop pretending we have it all together is the exact moment Jesus can actually work with us. Tuesday gave us Moses, and the beautiful truth that humility is not weakness. It is actually what makes a person genuinely usable in God's hands. Wednesday hit us with probably the most uncomfortable idea of the week. That pride might be the single most stubborn thing standing between us and a close relationship with God, precisely because it convinces us there is nothing to fix. And Thursday simply said, stop looking at yourself and look at Him, because you don't fix pride by focusing on pride. You fix it by fixing your eyes on Jesus and letting what you see there do its slow, quiet, beautiful work in you. And that is really what this whole week has been about. Not a self-improvement program or a checklist of ways to appear more humble. Just an invitation to get close enough to Jesus that everything else, including your own ego, starts to naturally fall away. Because the closer you get to that kind of light, the less you need to be seen by anyone else. So, if Jesus, the most powerful being in existence, chose the towel, the basin, and the cross, what does that tell you about what actually matters? And if you sat quietly with that today, really quietly, what might you finally be willing to let go of?